Welcome back, everybody. Today we are going to be going over Mesopotamia during the Bronze Age, and this is going to cover the period from 3300 BC to about 1600 BC. So grab a pen and paper, a tablet, and a laptop, and let's get going. So, we're going to start looking at the next steps on the human journey. In our last lecture, we looked at the rise of agriculture. We saw the first villages. We saw society begin to stratify or become more hierarchical. And we even saw the first forms of political organization begin to take form, namely among chieftains. In this lecture, we're going to look at civilization. This is a term that comes from the Latin word civis, which is city in Latin, and is going to give us the root for this phenomena. Now, why in Mesopotamia? Well, part of this is going to be related to its geography. The land is going to be fertile, and it's going to yield abundant results, which is going to enable more people to live together. But in order to fully harness this potential, people are going to need to cooperate. They're going to begin to organize themselves into cities or city-states. And these cities are going to be the drivers of innovation. And this is why we say civilization begins here. Because cities are going to be the real drivers of change from here on out. Now, those cities are going to be very innovative. They're also going to lead to competition amongst each other, eventually conflict, and then we're going to see even greater forms of organization rise and centralization at the end of this lecture. Now, as always, we're going to structure or try to structure our thoughts around four major categories: political, economic, social, and ideological. On the political end, we're going to see a shift from who rules, from priests to kings. And we're also going to go from city-states to territorial states. We'll unpack that as we go. On the economic side, we're going to see the rise of irrigated agriculture, which is going to lead to massive surplus and trade. And it's also going to begin to necessitate new inventions like writing to manage these resources and to more efficiently tax. We're going to also see that the social inequalities that began to take form in the Neolithic era are going to get even greater. And we're going to see even greater differences between the upper and lower strata of society, the different levels. We call this stratification. Lastly, we're going to peer a little into the ideology that helped motivate, the ideas that helped to motivate this society, which are mostly going to be religious in orientation. All right. And religion is not only going to be the basis for the first governments, because they're going to be based out of temples, but even kings are going to use religious authority to legitimize their authority. There are a few things that I want to clear up first. And one is the difference between the region Mesopotamia and some of the civilizations that have lived there. So Mesopotamia is an area. Different civilizations have inhabited this area. So, for instance, the Sumerians are going to be one of the first that we look at, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, and this is just in the earlier Bronze Age. Now, it's not important that you necessarily commit these dates to memory or anything like that. I just want to clear it up that when we talk about Mesopotamia, it's really a region. In some ways, you could say Mesopotamia still exists today, although many of these civilizations obviously are long gone. So where are we talking about exactly? The area of Mesopotamia is located in what we would call the Middle East, or Southwest Asia, perhaps. And you can see it here on the map. This area specifically would include modern-day Iraq. As a matter of fact, the word Mesopotamia means the land between the rivers. And so you can see the Tigris and the Euphrates River here. To the east, the land is bounded by the Zagros Mountains. These mountains extend along the top, where they transition into the Taurus Mountains, separating modern-day Iraq from modern-day Turkey. Mesopotamia stretches down along the mountains of modern-day Lebanon, loops around through the Arabian Desert, and then back around the Persian Gulf. And as you can see, this essentially creates a border around the area of the two rivers. If we were to look at the land of Mesopotamia, it basically starts off in the north as grassier, kind of scrubland, and gradually gets hotter and drier the further south we go, till eventually it transitions into the Arabian Desert. The land doesn't get a ton of rain on its own. Naturally, it would really only be suitable for maybe livestock farming, particularly like goats and sheep, and people have and still do herd animals there today. Now, naturally, the area would be too dry to do any type of large-scale agriculture. And it's really only the fact that the area is watered by these two rivers that makes life even remotely possible here. The two rivers, as we've mentioned, are the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. These are pretty important rivers to know, so you might want to commit them to memory. The Tigris River is the one further to the east, and the Euphrates is the one further to the west. These rivers are caused because you can see that in the Zagros and the Taurus Mountains, these are high enough mountains where they receive quite a bit of snowfall. This snow will melt as the spring and summertime come and feed the rivers. They will also bring alluvium. This is very fertile soil, and they'll come down and they will naturally fertilize the area, and not only provide water therefore, but also some pretty rich soil. The area is naturally treeless as a result of this, and is quite well suited for agriculture, as we'll see. One thing we should note, and this is going to play a large role in the Mesopotamian psyche, is that the rivers will bring life, but they're also capable of bringing death with them. Unlike the Nile River, which we'll see in a future lecture, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers can be very unpredictable, and therefore the area is prone to flooding. And this fear of floods really burrows into the Mesopotamian psyche and shapes the way they see the world. Now, on its own, the area is well watered, depending on the type of year. But early on, going back even into the Neolithic era, people had begun to help the river out, so to speak. They had begun to dig irrigation canals and dikes in order to further irrigate even more land than the rivers would, and also to begin to control them to some degree so that they wouldn't flood as badly as they were prone to do, and you could channel the water to where you needed it. And this, combined with the very rich soil, produced the conditions that created very, very large surpluses. Wheat and barley were native to the area. People also planted trees like dates and other fruits there. And so the area became very, very well provisioned with food. Now, this is great, but as you can imagine, digging an irrigation canal isn't something that you can do on your own. You need a lot of people involved. All of this is going to require more and more oversight. It's going to require more and more management. Someone is going to have to determine where the canals are going to be dug, what time of year they're going to be dug, what exactly is going to be planted. And also, someone is going to have to begin to construct places to store all of this surplus food. And what this is going to lead to over time is greater and greater amounts of centralized control and centralized management. Now the question is who is going to be doing this control and who is going to be doing this managing? And the answer in Mesopotamia is going to be temples. Oftentimes, land in Mesopotamia was already devoted to a particular local god, dating back into the Neolithic periods. Temples would often be built somewhere, and they would be patronized and frequented by various people. And this would be a meeting place where people would get together and worship. But increasingly, temples began to take on more of an economic role. They began to manage labor on these lands. They began to store the surplus in the temple itself and to manage resources. And as we're going to see, temples are going to become the nuclei of the first cities. Now, temples are going to become so wealthy that they are going to begin to have surpluses, right? So the land's very fertile and people are already storing it at temples. And in a time before money, temples are going to begin to redistribute some of this as rations or food to different sorts of people. Some of these people are going to be builders who are going to help to build the temple or other structures in the area. Some of them are going to be craftsmen who use some of the resources on behalf of the temple. The temple is going to also hire a lot of weavers, particularly women, who are going to weave textiles, because a lot of the nearby shepherds are also going to be making offerings, or they're going to be raising sheep that are owned by the temple, and this wool is going to be turned into clothing. And so the temple is going to redistribute a lot of this food and other resources out in a type of centralized economy. Temples are also going to begin to engage in trade outside of the area of Mesopotamia. So Mesopotamia itself produces a lot of food and it has some other resources, but it lacks a lot of resources. It lacks metals, it lacks timber. As I said, there weren't a lot of trees there. Spices, incense, some of these other items just aren't found in Mesopotamia. And so what temples are going to begin to do is they're going to begin to export what they have, namely food, pottery, textiles, and other things, and they're going to begin to export these outside of the area of Mesopotamia. They're going to send out merchant companies to get the resources that they need and bring them back to the temple, where oftentimes they'll be reworked and maybe even sold back to where they originally came from. In this way, Mesopotamia is going to begin to spread out its culture into the region. And in subsequent lectures, we'll see that this has important implications. For right now, though, I would like to pause and just acknowledge that cities are going to become really centers of culture. If you think about it, the life of a farmer in a village, in Mesopotamia versus one in Egypt, where we'll be looking to one in Europe or Asia, they're not that different, but cities are different. These are going to be economic centers. They're going to be centers of politics. They're going to be centers of culture and ideology. And cities are really going to become the drivers of innovation. And so that's why a course like this we call Western civilization. Civilizations are really drivers of culture. Okay. Well, I just want to also acknowledge that as society becomes more complex, the benefits of society aren't going to be spread equally. Priests and other wealthy landowners are going to reap the lion's share of the benefits. They're going to be at the top of society. They're going to hold political power, as we'll see. They're going to hold spiritual power in the case of priests, and also a great deal of economic power. Below them are skilled people. Maybe these are skilled craftsmen like potters and smiths and weavers. Oftentimes these are people who work directly for the temple. Or they might be merchants who also work directly for the temple. And their skills and their position in society mean that they live pretty well. The vast majority of the population are going to be farmers and laborers. These are people who usually live outside of the city. They are going to grow the crops and the food that is going to be taxed or given as offerings to the temple. And they're really the folks that are going to make the rest of this society possible, right? They're going to provide the resources that are going to make this society possible, although they're not going to reap a lot of the benefits. In addition to that, there was a slave class in Mesopotamia. Oftentimes, these would be prisoners who were captured in wars, or possibly debtors, people who couldn't pay their debts back and who were therefore forced into slavery. And a lot of these people are going to work at the temple. Some of them possibly as farmers, but a lot of them will be working on large construction projects in low-skilled areas, or maybe manufacturing things on behalf of the temple, unskilled positions. We should also acknowledge that in Mesopotamian society, as it was in virtually all societies, the vast majority of positions are going to go to men, although we should mention that there was a place for priestesses who could have significant amounts of power. But for the most part, women were expected to stay at home. They were expected to raise the family, and pretty much had very little public life. Early Mesopotamian government, therefore, was a theocracy. And a theocracy literally means rule by God or the gods, but usually what we mean by it is that it's ruled by religious authorities. Temples, as we saw, were the centers of society, and priests held not only great economic roles because of their access to wealth, but also what we would call sacral power or sacred power. They were seen as intermediaries between people and the gods, and so they garnered a lot of respect. Oftentimes, the high priest of the temple would also be the leader of the city. The temple itself would govern society. They would determine the infrastructure like walls, roads, and bridges to be built. They would organize defenses, and they would often manage the vast majority of the city's wealth through the temple. One of the most important developments to come out of Mesopotamia was the invention of writing. And this is directly related to the increasing scale and complexity of urban life. In a small agricultural village, there really isn't much need for writing or record keeping. But when you're running a vast operation like a Sumerian temple or city, the needs for writing suddenly become apparent. Now, writing didn't occur overnight. There was a long period of development, actually. We won't go into much of it, but essentially it started from pictographic symbols and gradually became more and more abstract until essentially it was impossible to tell what the image was unless you were trained in writing. So, for instance, you can see here the original pictograph for a bird kind of looks like a bird. It starts looking less and less like it until you get to the fully developed cuneiform, where it's really just a set of symbols that bear no resemblance to what it was originally intended. So why writing though? So part of it was to keep track of grain and livestock. As we said, temples were managing massive amounts of grain and livestock. Priests would begin to keep track of this by making impressions into clay. For the sake of speed, as we said, they eventually started to get away from actually making pictures. And they also began to create innovations that would allow them to express things that you couldn't really draw a picture of. So you can imagine drawing a picture of a bird, but how do you draw a picture of life? You don't. And so they came up with abstract symbols to represent abstract ideas as well. Now, the clay could be used and reused, or if it was something important, you might want to bake it. And once it was baked, it became permanent. We call this type of writing cuneiform, which means wedge-shaped writing. And that's because a wedge-shaped stylus would be used to make these impressions. Now, it's important to also mention that unlike our alphabet, which has 26 letters, this wasn't quite like that. The Mesopotamian writing system had thousands and thousands of characters. And it would really take a person many, many years to learn this writing system. And so literacy was going to remain quite low. And this was going to be part of that stratification that I mentioned. Very few people would have access to this powerful new invention, at least initially. Now, though Mesopotamian writing began with essentially economic records, receipts, if you will, eventually the Mesopotamians started to compose other things like poems and letters and laws and histories and prayers, and really everything that one could imagine. Now, it's also important to mention the rise of bureaucracy. And so what exactly is a bureaucracy? Well, they're kind of like government staff. If you think about it, unlike maybe a village chieftain who kind of has a more hands-on role with things, and there's really not a whole bunch of different things that need to be done, a city is quite a bit more complex. And so a city is going to need scribes and administrators, tax collectors, overseers, people to oversee public works projects. And all of these people are going to be part of the bureaucracy. They work for government and they do various tasks. So let's give a scenario. Let's say a temple wants to expand. They want to build a new temple. And so how is this done? How do you build a temple? Well, in order to do this, it's going to take an entire team. Someone is going to need to oversee the project as a whole. There's going to need to be another person that's going to have to organize the labor and act as a foreman, gather the skilled and unskilled laborers. Someone is going to have to make sure that the food resources are there to feed this massive workforce. Someone else is going to have to acquire local building materials, maybe the clay bricks. And maybe another person is going to have to organize a trade expedition to get the timber, the gold, and the jewels that will be needed for the temple. A team of scribes is going to have to record all the inputs and outputs of workers and hours and rations to be paid, the trade goods, and etc. So you can see that this is just part of what would be needed for this massive project. And so a skilled bureaucracy is going to be incredibly necessary, and it's going to be growing increasingly complex as the city itself grows complex. And you can imagine similar scenarios playing out for digging irrigation canals or city walls or constructing bridges. And so, as we can see, government is going to get more and more complex. Now, what we've been describing is a generic city, not any one city in particular. And this process of city formations occurred in multiple different places in Mesopotamia. By about 3000 BC, there were about 35 such cities. And these cities were largely self-governing or city-states. That is, they were independent. They, one city didn't control another city. The city would control the farmland around it, but that was essentially it. Each city was looked upon as being the home of a particular god, and each one would have had its own priest and temple staff. They would have been pretty similar, but they were independent of each other. Now, early on, there wasn't too many problems. These cities were far enough apart. There were buffer zones, no man's land, so to speak. And so there wasn't a ton of conflict. But as these cities grew larger and larger and their population and agricultural needs increased, cities began to extend their borders into these zones. And increasingly, conflict began to emerge amongst these city-states, beginning, around 2500 BC. And they would war over territory, over trade routes, and the like. Around 3000 BC, bronze had been invented, and it gives its name to this era. And bronze was going to create not only more effective tools, but also more effective weapons, and this was going to make conflict even more deadly. Now, it became the practice during times of war to elect a war leader. This might be the biggest, strongest, most aggressive guy in town. He'd probably be well born, but he would he would be selected on his military prowess. And this individual would lead the peasant armies into battle. Now, this position was temporary at first, but as war became more and more common, this position eventually became permanent. And so what we start to see happening around 2500 is the temple priesthood being supplanted by a secular or non-religious military power. Now, we shouldn't imagine that these individuals were necessarily hostile to priests or they didn't care about religion. As a matter of fact, they cared deeply about it. And part of this is that they are going to use religion to help bolster their own authority. And so they kind of make an arrangement with priests, we'll say. All right. And and they're going to rule as secular rulers, and they'll rule in tandem oftentimes with temples. Now, another thing that we see during this period of time is we start to see the cities begin to form first into leagues, into groupings of cities for protection. And usually one city will emerge as the dominant city. But increasingly, what we begin to see is we begin to see the rise of cities that are militarily strong enough to overtake their neighbors. The first to emerge was a city where the first leader to emerge to really do this was a man by the name of Sargon of Akkad. Created the first territorial state. Later on, a more lasting state is going to emerge, and this is going to be formed by a man by the name of Hammurabi, who a lot of people have heard of Hammurabi. And this is going to, his reign is going to last from about 1792 to about 1750. And his kingdom is going to be much longer lasting and much more influential than Sargon's kingdom was. The Babylon is going to be his capital, and this is going to have a very, very long and prestigious history in Mesopotamia. Now, as I've said, territorial states are larger than city-states. As a matter of fact, territorial states will often include several or even many different cities within their borders. This is going to give them an advantage that they have more resources, more manpower. They're going to be able to send out larger trade expeditions. But it's also going to create a lot of problems to govern. For one, instead of governing one city now, you have multiple cities. They could be in far-off regions. The populations might have different traditions. And this is going to have present all kinds of challenges. There's communication. There's the threat of local rebellion, as a city might not want to be ruled by another city far off. And it's going to require all sorts of administrative developments. One of the reasons Sargon's empire didn't last was because he never quite solved these problems. And that's going to be the virtue of Hammurabi, is he's going to overcome some of these problems and take the development of Mesopotamian civilization to the next level. Now, key to Hammurabi's success is to make use of the technology of writing to overcome some of these challenges. So probably what Hammurabi is best known for is the creation of a legal code. This can be seen to the right. This is a stele of Hammurabi's law. And the legal code is going to begin to standardize law across his territory. It's going to create a common sense of justice. It's going to create common norms. It's going to start to forge a sense of unity into what had been a fractious, disunited place. Hammurabi is also going to make use of writing to administer the empire. He's going to appoint local governors, people that are loyal to him, and he's going to staff these cities with his own officials. These individuals will be responsible for sending regular communication back and forth between Hammurabi, so he doesn't need to be physically present in one place. They're going to be able to assess taxes, and they're going to be able to assess manpower and keep accurate records of this, so that scribes back in Babylon will be able to determine the resources at his disposal. And one of Hammurabi's big innovations is going to begin to use tax revenues to create a standing army. This is a professional army as opposed to a peasant militia, and these individuals are going to be paid from taxes rather than from plunder, which had been the old way. And so writing is going to be incredibly useful, right? So to get the tax to pay the army, for Hammurabi to communicate with officers out in the field, to be able to respond to threats, to keep track of troop strength. And it's going to allow him to expand his borders and to conquer his rivals ultimately. And so in many ways, Hammurabi's Babylon is the culmination of this long period that we've seen that's going to take several hundred years. And so as Hammurabi undoubtedly looked over his kingdom, and he looked out over his achievement, he was really standing on 2,000 years of development. He didn't probably think about it too often, but really this had been based off of the fertile land of Mesopotamia that created surplus trade, wealth, and urbanization. And this, as we've seen, required more and more collective action. He also would have stood on political innovations, first based out of the temples and its economy, then to kingship and territorial states, and also the bureaucracy that enabled these governments to begin to manage these territories. Economic specialization was going to lay the groundwork for urban life, and it was also going to lead to greater social stratification, as we've seen. And Hammurabi and the priests that preceded him would have used religion to begin to centralize power. They would have used religion to create the first monumental structures like ziggurats, the step temples that we've seen. And they would use writing as a tool for not only administration, but also to tell the stories and to legitimize their power. Looking forward, we're going to begin to move out of Mesopotamia. We're going to see that Mesopotamian civilization spreads to the larger Middle East, where cities, laws, writings, and its myth are going to have a big impact. But before we do that, we're going to turn to another early civilization to the south and west of Mesopotamia, and that's Egypt. And Egypt's going to be similar in to Mesopotamia in some ways. It's going to be a river valley civilization, but unlike Mesopotamia, which was unpredictable with its floods and with its invasions and wars, we're going to see that Egypt is going to be different. It's going to have a stable form of government, a stable geographical position, and that it's going to be marked by harmony and centralization rather than competition like in Mesopotamia. Together with Mesopotamia, Egypt is going to ultimately lay the foundations for later Near Eastern and Western developments. And so I'll see you in our next episode as we turn to Egypt.